So now we're going to start on chapter 9. Just like chapter 6, I'll have two videos for chapter 9, but you'll see a lot of the concepts are overlapping with these two chapters. So now we're going to talk about wage and salary structures. We were already talking about this by the end of chapter 6. Um, but just to give you a review, these are organized frameworks that establish our pay relationships among jobs. In chapter 6, we went through some of the decisions you have to make in creating a salary structure in your organization. The purpose is that we want to create some internal consistency while maintaining external competitiveness. So we want to be able to tell our employees how the salary structure is created and why their job falls where it does in that salary structure. But we also want to be cognizant of the fact that the market has priced some of these jobs in very different ways and that we want to stay competitive with the way that other organizations are paying for these jobs. For the strategic importance of a salary structure is that you're balancing internal equity with the market realities. And that's why we often have to go back every few years and change our salary structures because the market has changed quite a bit, but also potentially the work that our organization does, the core work that it does may have changed, and that changes the internal equity of a lot of the positions. So the core components of salary structures include lots of different things. I'm just going to touch on some of these because again, we'll get into these in more depth later in the class. I've already mentioned job evaluations. This is a systematic assessment of the relative job worth. Essentially, what we're doing is we do a job analysis first where we figure out what are the tasks that are part of each of the jobs. And then the job evaluation puts those different job roles into a hierarchy within the organization based on their worth to the organization for the kind of work that that organization does. What job evaluation means, though, is that that hierarchy could look different in two different organizations that are in the same industry. And that's because those organizations may have different competitive advantages. They may also value different kinds of jobs very differently based on what they think that their core work is. We also have pay grades. We already saw this a little bit in the past slide where there was a slide on showing traditional pay grades and then broadbanding. These are groupings of jobs with similar internal value, and then we can put pay ranges within those pay grades where we have a minimum, midpoint, maximum pay for each grade. That was the in the traditional structure, that was the boxes where you had a minimum pay of like 40,000 and your max pay was like 56,000, and that's within that job group. That's as far as you could go. And then we have progression mechanisms like promotions, and that's how employees can move through those ranges. And in the past, when we used to have a lot of pay ranges and pay grades, you would get promoted and there would be a career progression. Like you would know what the career ladder was when you started your whatever job you started in the organization to work your way up in the organization. And so you went from pay grade to pay grade through those promotions. We don't do that as much now. A lot of times we don't always even have a very clear career ladder in a lot of organizations. And since we use broadbanding, we don't need to show you how your pay can increase over time by going across pay grades and getting these promotions because we can keep you within the same broadband for some time, and you can even be moving across job groups and stay within that same broadband, but have your compensation increasing from year to year. So here's just an example. When they said the minimum, maximum, and midpoint, the pay policy line here is the midpoint, but it doesn't have to be the midpoint, or it's just above the midpoint. The midpoint is just the midpoint between the minimum and maximum. We'll talk about what a pay policy line is later, but essentially that's where you want your pay to be across these different grades. I just wanted to show you what these look like. You do not have to know these specific details necessarily right now. Just understand what these ideas are. There will be some questions on the quiz where it's asking about strategy and choosing different strategies that may be related to pay grades or broadbanding. I just want you to have a general sense of what those things are so you can think about what strategy makes sense for the problem we're trying to address in our compensation system. So I've already alluded to the fact that there are lots of things changing within organizations in terms of compensation. So again, traditionally we used to have these numerous narrow pay grades with very small overlaps so that in order to move pay grades, you have to get promoted into another job. And now we use a lot of broadbanding where there's a lot of overlaps, so you don't really have to change the group that you're in for pay, and you can keep increasing your pay over many, many years. We've also gone from rigid hierarchies to flexible frameworks. A lot of times this is because different job roles, the tasks will um, be meaningful in very different ways over across time. So it's not like the work stays the same for very long for an organization. But another thing, we'll talk about this later in this slide deck, is that we might pay more for skills or competencies that people have, and they become more flexible. When the more skills that your employees have, the more flexible they can be with changes that are happening within the market, versus like having job roles with very specific tasks and just paying for those tasks. We often need employees to develop skills and new competencies to keep up with technological changes, with market changes. And so that's where the flexible frameworks can be very helpful. And then we also have to adapt to changing organizational structures. A lot of organizations are trying to flatten themselves out. They want faster decision making to really keep up with the changes in the market. And so we see a lot of organizational structures changing that requires compensation structures changing as well. So I already mentioned job analysis, so we'll get a little more in depth here. This is before we organize jobs, we have to know what each job comprises. What are the tasks that are part of each job? The reason I'm going to repeat this a few times in this slide deck, and we'll learn about it more in um, uh, later chapters, is the job analysis really the basis of internal pricing for your organization. Hopefully all of you have heard of job analysis before and have maybe studied it a little bit more than we are right now, because it's actually kind of the basis for a lot of what HR does. We can't write job descriptions if we don't do a job analysis. We can't set up people's pay fairly internally without having a job analysis. We can collect information for job analysis in multiple different ways. Some really common ways are observing employees on the job, especially if it's a job like manufacturing where you can see what people are doing throughout the day and see what kinds of um, skills they're using while they're doing that job. You can survey or interview employees or their supervisors about their jobs. There's ONET. There's lots of different ways that you can collect information about the tasks that are part of jobs. Job analysis helps us determine what knowledge, skills, and abilities are needed to do a job. This is why we use it for writing job descriptions. It helps us determine the essential functions of a job for Americans with Disability Act compliance. Again, those different knowledge, skills, and abilities can be worth a different amount in the organization. So we can use how much they're worth within the organization to determine where these jobs sit within the hierarchy in the organization, but also how much they should be compensated. We do have to conduct these regularly to update our job descriptions and also to update our compensation systems. And in some industries where things are changing very rapidly, a job analysis might be needed, every few months or every year. In others where maybe things are not changing quite as rapidly, you can wait every few years to do a job analysis. Those job analyses will be used in the job evaluation, which is where you organize the jobs in an organization. You can group jobs into job families, which I talked about in chapter 6. And then you can create a hierarchy of jobs in the organization. If you have only a few jobs in the organization because your organization is fairly small, you do not have to have job groups or job families. But when you're in larger organizations, that's an easy way to organize the different kinds of jobs that might have different kinds of pay attached to them based on market pricing, but based on also the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for those jobs within that job family or job group. Um, the more tasks in a job that are core to the organization's mission, essentially with job evaluation, the higher that job will be in that internal job hierarchy, and the more the employees with those job roles will get paid.